The fee is $80, and that's a 5-year duration, which works out to be a $16 per annum cost. That's the equivalent of the cheapest in Australia, which is the equivalent of the Victorian check, which is $16 a year as well. All volunteers, authorised carers, adults residing in authorised carers' home, any professional placements you might take on, anyone who is looking to adopt kids in New South Wales. It is the exact same process, the same check, but there's no fee associated with it. So for your volunteers and any professional placements you take on, anyone who might be engaged in a volunteer role, they are obligated to apply, they are obligated to then go to the motor registry and provide their ID, but there isn't any fees associated with it. The only difference between the Working with Children check processing in regard to paid versus volunteer will be there will be a different letter on the end of numbers. So your way to identify what their Working with Children check number is, someone will present to you, it'll say WWC, it'll have a 7-digit number combination, and for volunteering, have a V on the end of it. If they're in a paid role or they've obtained the paid Working with Children check, it will have an E on the end of it for employment. They are the exact same criminal record check, the exact same process and stringent security associated with it in regard to the clearance. It's just a difference in regard to separating what is a paid role and what is a volunteering role or student on placement. For those organisations that may have paid or even trainee or casual workforce, there is the ability for someone, if they can't pay the $80 upfront cost, they aren't able to obtain that, they can go and obtain their Working with Children check volunteer number, so they can tick the box and say I'm volunteering. Once they have that volunteering number, they can progress into a paid role, but 30 days from the day that they start in that paid position, they will be required to pay the $80 fee. So that gives them the ability to go through at least one pay cycle to then have the funds available. So the law will require someone has a clearance to work, and we don't want to disadvantage people who might be in the casual workforce or progressing from a trainee type role into paid employment, and they don't have the money up front and therefore their employment's delayed. So they can operate under a volunteer number. They may have obtained their volunteer number already in a different capacity. They can start a job in a paid role, but within 30 days, a calendar month, they're required to then go and make that payment. When they make that payment, their number would only progress from the same 7 digits, just from a V across to an E. So you don't need 2 separate numbers to volunteer or to work in paid employment. You only operate under that one number. Speaking of numbers, we've had a lot of inquiries as to whether we're going to have a similar type licence or card to other states and territories. So the blue card in Queensland, the Oprah card in Northern Territory, the Victorian Working with Children check, etc. We went and spoke to those agencies and jurisdictions. They had positive and negative feedback about issuing cards. First and foremost, they all said they're very, very expensive. And as a result, in certain states and territories, the cost of the Working with Children check is quite high in regard to the fee that we've applied. Secondly, there's a real issue with lost and stolen cards reissuing a duplicate and not knowing where the original is. And thirdly, in Queensland, there was a very short amount of time where the blue card was fraudulently replicated. And as a result of that, they established a number system where you were required to verify the number on that card because they had concerns about whether people could fraudulently replicate a secure card. So in New South Wales, A, to keep the cost down and B, to keep the security nice and high, we're not going to be issuing cards or licences. When you apply and you're successful in getting your Working with Children check clearance to work with kids, you nominate whether you want it via email or through the standard mail, and it'll actually respond back to you. So I'll get an email back saying, here's your clearance to work with children, WWC, 7 digits, and if I'm volunteering, I'll have a V on the end of it. And I then quote that number to any organisation who engages me. So that's my number, it's attached to my identity. If I don't engage in a child-related role or I go overseas for 2 years, we're not going to reissue your number to someone else, because if there's any sort of offence or concerning behaviour by another individual, that could implicate you if you went into child-related employment down the track. So your number is yours. It's the 7-digit number. We needed that many in regard to the calculations of how many are going to be issued. If for any reason people forget their number, they can contact us. We'll go through a few security questions and then we'll provide it to them over the phone or via email again. It's valid for 5 years. The reason why there is an expiry or a duration is because we need to do a national record check every 5 years. We do have what's called continuous monitoring in New South Wales, which is a new system which is very, very exciting from our perspective because it's a heightened security measure attached to the check. When people obtain their clearance and they're issued with their number, you are not only agreeing to your criminal record check being checked at the time of application, but you're actually agreeing for your criminal record to be shared by New South Wales Police with the agency that oversees the Working with Children check. And in that 5-year duration, if someone is charged or convicted with a serious sex or violence crime, we will do a risk assessment immediately on that person and what the incident is or what the concern is and the charge is. If the risk is too great to children in New South Wales, we have the ability to bar or disqualify that person from working with children, even though we've already previously issued them with a clearance. So if they have a number and you verify that number, they then go on to commit a serious sex or violence crime within New South Wales. Police notify us of their concerns. We do a risk assessment. If the outcome is that they need to be barred, there's a bar associated with that behaviour, we will contact the individual and let them know that by law they must stand down from any child-related work. Work does constitute volunteering or student placements as well. And we will then follow up with the organisation that's verified that number. So we'll actually contact your organisation. We won't discuss anything that's private or confidential, so we won't be talking about what the charge is, when it occurred, who the victim is, any sort of circumstances around that, but we will be advising you that that person cannot be engaged in a child-related role. So the government's actually notifying you that it's against the law and it's a breach of the Act for you to continue to engage a person who has become barred through continuous monitoring. So that's the first time we've had any sort of system like that in New South Wales. Essentially, in the current Working with Children check, it does a very good purpose, but concerns were raised where if I was submitted for a check today and cleared, and then I provide that clearance to an organisation, in the next 5 years, if I was to commit an offence or charge or be convicted with something, it's up to me to actually notify my organisation. In this new system, the government will be actually advising you that someone can no longer work with children by law. For that reason, we need a whole range of things in place in regard to registering your organisations as a volunteer group, and I'll talk about the verification process. Once you look someone's number up, they are attached to your registration. And in the continuous monitoring type scenarios, there might be someone who is charged or convicted, and we then have to go and contact 8, 10 or 12 organisations that have verified that number. As a result, our compliance team and programs are expanding quite rapidly. We have systems in place to identify that that person can no longer work with children. We'll contact organisations. Typically it'll be over the phone. We're not going to ring up and say, hit the panic button, someone has recently been charged with something, you have to take matters into your own hands. We're simply going to ring up and say something like, does Morgan Lander currently work there? Or can I please speak to Morgan Lander? If you say no, they no longer engage here, they're no longer a volunteer, we don't have any connection with them, we'll just say thanks for your time. If you advise us that they are in a child-related role, that's when we'll let you know that we need to talk to you about something quite serious. That person can no longer engage in a child-related position. We need you to ensure that they stand down or they're removed from that type of role. And I'll talk about what actions can be taken in that regard.